Yes, we were. I think so. But this is not very strong, so I don't think it's.
So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Surah Al-Shams was just continuing where we left off. And I always underscore this. Remember that all the early revelation sets the foundation for the Islamic message. In fact, if you're not anchored in the early revelation, then you have a very weak tie to or a weak grasp of the Islamic message. And so just quickly, I'm just using the translation of the Study Quran, which, as I said, is a good translation. The sun and its morning brightness, by the moon when following it, by the day when disclosing it, by the night when enshrouding it, by the sky and the one who established it, by the earth and the one who spread it or unfolded it, by the soul and the one who fashioned it and inspired it. As to what makes it iniquitous or reverent, indeed, he prospers who purifies it, and indeed he fails who obscures it. And that's where we stopped. And just as a quick review, we noted that Surah Al-Shams reminds you of the intimate connection between the logic of creation itself, the cycle between day and night, the cycle of creation, the very logic of existence, which is movement, because non-movement or the lack of an active agent, in other words, being status, leads to deconstruction or leads to diminution. Death in itself is a form of the end of movement, and what you know about the world of creation, as we said last time, tells you about the world inside of you. And the world inside of you, it is a potential that is created by the divine. What makes the human soul a true gift is that it comes directly from the truth of the divine, that exceptional luminous force or luminous power of divinity. But that potential, like everything else that has the power of movement, it can move towards light or it can move towards darkness, and it is you who makes that decision. And we talked about this, that whatever theological school you ultimately end up adopting, you end up with the essential starting point of potentiality, that God creates the potential within you to rise to great heights of self-perception, to rise to great heights of reaching and, in fact, achieving divinity within you, realizing divinity within you, becoming transparent within, and seeing through yourself. And as we said last time, that the biggest error of, the biggest folly of human consciousness is that humans are very capable of ending up worshiping themselves by projecting whims, projecting what they like, and transforming what they like into an objectivity, that basically constructing consciousness within as an objective reality without, and then embracing that as the truth. And it is all reflection, pondering, reflecting, thinking about, and studying. The logic of creation itself leads to self-cleansing and the power to look within, and that the attainment of divinity, luminosity, is not possible unless you learn to discipline that whimsical self, that the ego, basically. Because the ego is very powerful, and and I've talked about this in several surahs, touched upon this theme, that even when we say we love someone, the issue that we always come back to, and the issue that so many of the writings of Muslim theologians about love focused on, is that do you basically love yourself through the claim that you love another? So there are many husbands and wives in the world that really, they say I love you, but what they love is the image they constructed of the other. But whether that image is actually true to that person that they say they love is a separate, completely different question. You know, and this is where you often find where the coldness and the alienation starts growing in relationships. But we do that with brothers, we do that with sons and daughters. We say, I love my child, but do you love the child as the child is, or do you love the child as you've constructed the child in some type of objective construct of what that child in your mind ought to be? And so basically you love yourself through the claim of the love of others. And as we said, we do that first and foremost with God. We claim to love God, but often God is just a vehicle for pandering to ourselves. And then so all of that is just review. And we got to we stopped at the verse 12, with the most wretched of them was, okay, so when the Surah, basically the story of Al-Naqa, or the camel. So كذبت وقد خاب من دساها. This is where we basically stopped. كذبت ثمود بطغواها, and this is where we were supposed to begin for today. So right after this introduction, the Quran invokes the story of Thamud and the Prophet Salih. Like a lot of whether you're talking about any historical source that invokes an old mythology, and by mythology here I mean an inherited narrative, not necessarily a fiction, but an inherited narrative. When it points to an inherited narrative, you find many different sources that you can possibly search into in order to understand that indication within the text. So when the Quran refers to the story of Thamud, the Quran in other surahs elaborates a little bit about the story of Thamud, but it doesn't give specific laid out details of who Thamud was and who the Prophet Salih was. Now, this is, by the way, an Quranic style, because in the Bible, for instance, the Bible often, especially the Old Testament, reads like a old medieval history book. this king took over, this king was the son of this person was the daughter of this, then they did this, then they went there, and then there was this battle, and then this person died, and then this person lived. The Old Testament pretty much reads like an old historical narrative of the Israelites. The New Testament is basically a historical narrative of Jesus of Nazareth, who was also an Israelite. The Quran doesn't give you, and with few exceptions like the story of Joseph, the prophet Joseph alayhi salam, but for the most part, it makes a reference and then makes an it deducts or summarizes the moral lesson without giving you much historical detail. So first, I'll go a little bit into the story of Thamud and why in this context the story of Thamud. Thamud, as a clan, was part of the inherited mythology of the Arabs, known as a tribe that existed. Arabs have various conflicting claims, but historians say that Thamud was around 6th century before BC, before Christ, to the 4th century. So we can't actually pin down whether it was 6th or 4th, but they existed between either 6th or 4th, between 6th and 4th century BC, 600 or 400 before Christ. And they existed in an area called Al-Hijr. Al-Hijr was a part of a larger territory known as Mada'in Salih. The reason they lived in Arab memory was there is an area that exists in Saudi Arabia now called Al-Hijr. Al-Hijr was known among the Arabs of old as a cursed town. It's abandoned, and there are a lot of very interesting things you read in Arabic literature about it being inhabited by jinn, and all types of stories about people who went in there and disappeared, or some like horror-like stories. You could have made into a very freaky Hollywood movie. Unfortunately, that Hijr that the Arabs report on in Mada'in Salih, for the most part, has not survived. There are a little bit of archaeological remains that we can find, some writing that we can date back to the 6th century BC. There's even a reference to the tribe of Thamud in some of the archaeological material that we found, but most of their historical remains have vanished. After the destruction of the tribe of Thamud, which I'll come back to, that same area of Mada'in Salih, but not Al-Hijr. Al-Hijr is like a more specific town within a larger territory of Mada'in Salih. So within the area of Mada'in Salih, close to Al-Hijr, the town of Al-Hijr, a tribe known as Lahyan and Al-Daydaniyun. The Lahyaniyun and the Daydaniyun settled there in the 3rd and 2nd BC, 300, 200 years before Christ. More archaeological remains were found that belong to Al-Lahyaniyun, and I'll tell you why I'm mentioning all of that in a second, and the Daydaniyun. Then around the 1st century AD, so this is the first 100 years after Christ, the Arab Nabateans, Nabat, that's the major Arab tribe that is at the heart of so many of the Arabs that exist today, settled in that area. After them, there's a Roman invasion where the Nabat are defeated and the Romans actually invade and occupy the area of Mada'in Salih. And then after the Romans, there's the Islamic Empire, and Mada'in Salih is abandoned for the most part until the Ottomans build a railway station that goes from Istanbul to Mecca, and it passed through Mada'in Salih. So you had various settlements in this area. Now, why do I mention all of that? Because today, the Mada'in Salih that exists, some people go there and they see the historical remains and they say, oh, this belongs to Qawm Thamud. No. The historical remains that are in Mada'in Salih that the Saudi government today is renovating to attract tourists. Some of it goes back to the Ottoman period, some of it goes back to the Roman period, some of it goes back to the Nabatean period in the 1st century AD, and very little of it goes back to the period of Al-Lahnaaniyun and Al-Daydaniyun in the 3rd and 2nd BC. So when if you look it up on computer, you'll see a carving in a mountain. One of the most spectacular things you can see is this rock, and there is a carving of a tomb in that rock. You can see it on the net. When I was younger, I actually climbed into that tomb, and it was very, very exhausting, very dusty, very hot, very exhausting, but it was fascinating. That carving goes back to the 1st AD, so it doesn't go back to the Qawm Thamud. Just so if anyone tells you, oh, there are historical remains of Qawm Thamud, no, the only archaeological remains are left are some fragments of writings that we found. Everything else post-dates Qawm Thamud. Okay, so Qawm Thamud, which predates the Nabat, the settlement of the Nabat in this area, was a very old Arab tribe. We know of a prophet called Salih that was sent to Ahl Samud. Ahl Samud were known for their excessive materialism. They became an Arabic lore, sort of the example of this stingy, cold-hearted, what we would today consider a cold-hearted capitalist, someone who wants the bottom line and will always make a buck, regardless of who suffers, they will always go for making the deal, striking the deal, and making a profit regardless of the cost to other human beings. And there are even some interesting amthila, how do you translate amthila? Examples of in Arabic literature about people who will not be generous unless there's a material profit to be made from generosity. It survived in Arabic literature and in Arabic lore as the attributes of Qawm Thamud. So the Prophet Salih is sent to Qawm Thamud. Reportedly, he lives among them for, we're not quite sure how long, but 20, 30 years preaching within Qawm Thamud with very limited success and effect. And then the lore from there gets, there's a lot of conflicting stories. So I'll give you some of them. And we don't have time to, as I said, the scholar always has to pick what they present. And we could give a long lecture about Qawm Thamud and what we know and don't know about them. But anyway, so some of the reports, and ones that you find in a lot of, is that they challenge Salih to present a miracle. You're telling us that we have to take care of the homeless, we have to take care of the poor, we have to take care of the orphans. You're always demanding that we part with our money. we are not going to believe you, we're not going to follow you unless you... And they repeatedly challenged the Prophet Salih alayhi salam to present him with a miracle. And to make a long story short, there is a particular confrontation with a particular individual. When the Quran says, إِذٍ بَعْثَ أَشْقَاهَا, many reports say that it refers, how did this guy translate it? When the most wretched of them was dispatched. Many commentators say that when it says إِذٍ بَعْثَ أَشْقَاهَا and the most wretched of them was dispatched, that it is referring to a specific individual. If you want to know his name, if you're curious, I'll tell you. But, Qadar bin Salif. A man called Qadar bin Salif who confronts the Prophet Salih and says, okay, if you want us to believe you, supposedly Qadar was among the most brutal of them and the most materialistic and also one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, depending on the story that you read. And then Qadar bin Salif says, okay, make a camel emerge out of this rock. Qawm Thamud were famous for their carving in rocks. And according to the Quran, they made their homes, they carved their homes, their houses into rock. None of that survived, sadly. Partly because when the Madain settled there, they undid a lot of what the archaeological remains of Qawm Thamud. Anyway, so some of the narratives say at that point God makes a camel emerge out of this rock, and that becomes the story of the camel. Other narratives say no, that's not true, but rather that Salih comes to them with a camel, and the camel does not emerge from a rock, and we don't know where the camel comes from, but other than that the Prophet Salih came to them one day with a camel. Now, the challenge, regardless of what you want to believe, that's not, it's something that doesn't concern me. I mean, whether the camel emerged from a rock or a camel was bought from a market or whatever it is not material as far as I'm concerned. Qawm Thamud were also known, Arabs cherished and were kind to their livestock, because the livelihood of Arabs often depended on the survival of their livestock. So if you have a buffalo, or if you have a camel, if you have a horse, you're not just going to easily replace it. Thamud went down in Arab lore for being so wealthy that they were actually not kind to their livestock at all. They were known for their brutality towards animals. Some of the stories give you the way they sacrificed animals, breaking bones and things like that. So the Prophet Salih comes to them with this camel and says, here's God's decree for you. Not only will you honor the camel and not hurt the camel, but you will share your resources with the camel. The camel has a right to drink from the pasture. On the day that the camel drinks from the pasture, you will leave the camel alone. You will not even go close to the pasture. In other words, drawing boundaries to them. Now, Muslim theologians talk a great deal about, was the challenge simply sort of the last opportunity given to them by God, or was it to force these miserable, materialistic, cruel people to put them to the test? Are you actually going to honor something that you consider vastly below you, like an animal? And especially Thamud were, one of the stories is that they would break the bones of the legs of camels, and the way they sacrifice them, they put them on the altar with their legs broken, and then they let the animal die slowly. which is very unlike all the most of the sacrificial practices of the Middle Eastern cultures that simply slit the throat of an animal rather than the slow agonizing death. Anyway, so then Thamud challenged Saleh and went ahead and killed not just the camel, but killed the camel had a little baby camel, and killed the baby camel as well. And then after that, they're given 3 days and nights, after which they're destroyed. Now, there's some interesting things to point out about the reference to Qawm Thamud after that introduction. One, Quraysh knew the lore about Thamud, and they believed that the area of Al-Hijr was a cursed area. The threat to them would have resonated to the Quraysh, because basically it's as if the Quran, after giving them this introduction, saying, remember that that the same God and Creator who created the night and day, who created the cycle of life itself, who have created life and death, is capable of transforming your status from the Quraysh, the wealthy, powerful tribe, to the people of Thamud. So that's one. In other words, a direct threat that your fate could be like the fate of Thamud. A second point. Up to this point, one of the major controversies between the Nabateans, the Arabs of Arabia, the Persians, and the Israelites, and the Christians that existed mainly in Egypt, with very few numbers in Arabia. But of course, even in Egypt, Christians there was a big difference between the Roman Christians, who were oppressing the Coptic Christians in Egypt, was whether prophets are exclusively limited to the Israelite people or not. The Bible, the Old Testament, is a story of the Israelite prophets. And according to the Bible, prophets are only sent, according to the Old Testament specifically, prophets are only sent within the people of Israel. Now, in especially Talmudic theology, there emerges, especially after the Babylonian persecution, there is a reaction to the Babylonian persecution and the destruction of the temple, that a narrative among the Israelites that we are the chosen people and God wouldn't send a prophet to other than Israelites because they are not worthy. Jesus was obviously an Israelite prophet. He was Palestinian, but he was a Jew. When you open up the Bible of Matthew, for instance, the first thing you see, the first page in the Gospel of Matthew, is the lineage of Jesus. Why is that lineage there? To prove that Jesus is an Israelite. That's the first point, because if Jesus is not an Israelite, then his entire preaching in the temple and to the Jews, whatever their sect, no one would have listened to him. In early Christianity, in fact, and there's a book called The Lost Christianities, which you can read if you want. There was a huge debate whether Jesus, before Pauline Christianity, was ever intended to have a message outside the Israelites. In other words, that he basically preached for the Israelites, and that his message was a liberation message like Joseph and like Moses to the Israelites. Jesus has reported himself in many Gospels to say that as much, that I've been sent to the Israelites to liberate the Israelites. Of course, in Pauline Christianity, which is a different story, then we have the universalization and Romanization of Christianity. And the adoption then of Christianity by the Roman Byzantine Empire and so on. But so one of the biggest debates was that the Israelites would always tell the Nabateans, you guys are far below us, no prophets are sent amongst you. The Persians claimed to have prophets like Nebuchadnezzar, but the Israelites also said Persians can't have prophets. Prophets are only sent within the people of Israel. When Surah Al-Shams is revealed, it was the first time that the Quran announces, sort of, if you will, takes sides. I'm using, it's a bit of a vulgar, because the Quran doesn't take sides, but that the Quran basically, what it will then later on in other surahs say, that in fact God sends prophets, and God doesn't punish without prophets in all types of nations and all types of people. So the Quran challenges the idea. And in fact, most Muslim theologians, for instance, consider Nebuchadnezzar to have been a prophet, a Persian prophet.
Is that Zoroaster?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
With his message corrupted later, but anyway. So when Salih in this surah is identified to the Arabs as a prophet, the reason it's significant theologically is that this new religion of Islam, you would think that it would want to get the Jews on its side by saying, we stick to the Mediterranean narrative of the prophets only come within the Israelite lineage. But it did exactly the opposite by saying that Salih was a prophet. Now, of course, Quraysh wasn't interested in whether Salih was a prophet or not. Quraysh thought that people of Thamud and anything related to the people of Thamud was cursed. And Quraysh didn't even have, there's no evidence that they knew anything about or that they believed or preserved the story of the camel that was killed by Qawm Thamud. So you find it's not just warning Quraysh about God's possible punishment, but also breaking ground with the traditional biblical narrative of Israelite prophets. Okay. Anything else you want to say about this? So as just when the most wretched of them was dispatched, we talk about this. This is the guy who challenged the Prophet Saleh. So the messenger of God said to them, that's a reference to Saleh, this is the she-camel of God, give her drink, allow her to go to the pasture and drink. But they denied him, but they refused to give her access to the pasture and hamstrung her, killed the camel. There's some narratives that they say they tortured the camel and the camel's poor baby. So their Lord crushed them for their sin and leveled it. فَسَوَّاهَا. Leveled the area of Hijr. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because of the modern mythology. A lot of modern mythology tells you, and in Saudi Arabia, most people would say things like, oh, Mada' and Salih. When you go to Mada' and Salih, you'll see the archaeological remains of Qawm Thamud. Well, the Quran said that their habitat was destroyed. So in fact, it's consistent with what we find out through archaeological works later on, that practically nothing is left of Qawm Thamud. And what you find in Madain Salih today belongs to either the Roman period or the Nabatean period and so on. And he fears not the consequence thereof, وَلَا يَخَافُ عُقْبَاهَا. What is this referring to? Who is it that doesn't fear? وَلَا يَخَافُ عُقْبَاهَا. Who's the damir here referring to? Is it the Thamud that didn't fear the results and the consequences, and they discovered what the consequences is? Does it refer to Ashqaha, that man that challenged and is said to have actually tortured the camel and killed it? That leader of Thamud that challenged Salih and killed the camel? Or does it refer to God? That it is inconsequential. It is no great matter. It is no great feat for God to destroy an arrogant and powerful tribe like Thamud. It is a simple matter for God. Interestingly, most say it refers to God. But it's not an overwhelming majority, it is a simple majority. But you'll find a lot of commentators that tells you, no, the reference here is to Thamud. That Thamud didn't fear the consequences. And if they would have feared the consequences of their behavior, this whole episode of their destruction would have been avoided. Now, this is a common theme in the revelation that comes later on in the Quran, warning people of the consequences of following their egos. And that's the nexus between the moral, spiritual nexus. How do people rise to a level of becoming demigods themselves? In other words, indulging in self-worship. Indulging in self-worship in a variety of ways. But they become their own Mecca. They become their own center of reference. Whether it is, how do you end up like the tribe of Thamud? You end up like the tribe of Thamud by ignoring what comes at the beginning of Surah Al-Shams. That you've disconnected from the logic of divinity and the moral and the ethic of divinity itself. I think that's it for Surah Al-Shams.